What if the story everyone accepted was never the real story at all? What if the silence, the missing paperwork, and the sudden defensiveness weren't coincidences but warning signs? In recent weeks, a storm has been building around Turning Point USA financial questions, internal audits, names that were once untouchable now being spoken in whispers. And at the center of it all, one figure appears increasingly exposed as new claims. Documents and timelines collide in ways that simply do not add up. According to multiple reports and insider accounts, this wasn't a slow unraveling. It was a rupture. Allegations tied to money flows, internal oversight failures, and a controversial audit have triggered public scrutiny that refuses to die down. And when Candace Owens publicly raised concerns, the pressure didn't just increase, it exploded. Because once questions about finances surface, they don't stay contained. They spread. They force people to explain what was never meant to be seen. And for those who benefited from the old narrative, that moment can be devastating. Before we go any further, if you believe uncomfortable questions deserve honest answers, take a second to like this video, share it, and subscribe. It helps this conversation stay visible. And I want to hear from you. Comment your opinion as we go, and tell us where you're watching from. Turning Point USA did not rise quietly. It grew fast, loud, and powerful, positioning itself as one of the most influential political nonprofit organizations in America. With millions in donations, national events, and a strong media presence, TPUSA built a public image centered on grassroots activism, youth engagement, and ideological clarity. At the top of that structure were figures whose names became inseparable from the brand. Public-facing personalities who spoke confidently about values, transparency, and accountability. Behind the scenes, however, TPUSA operated like many large nonprofits through a complex web of related entities, internal departments, and financial channels that most donors would never see. One of the central figures in this story is Erika Kirk, a name that until recently stayed largely out of direct controversy. Publicly, she was presented as a stabilizing force within the organization. Privately, according to insiders, she held enormous influence over operations, decision-making, and internal access. Influence that would later come under intense scrutiny. Then there is Candace Owens, a media figure known for her willingness to publicly challenge institutions she believes are hiding uncomfortable truths. When she spoke out, it wasn't in vague terms. Her comments directly questioned financial transparency and internal accountability within TPUSA, questions that many insiders claim had been whispered internally for months. Another name that repeatedly surfaces is Mikey McCoy, whose role becomes critical once oversight and auditing enter the picture. His involvement ties directly into claims surrounding internal reviews and what some describe as a controversial or quietly sidelined audit process. Together, these individuals form the core of the unfolding narrative, an organization built on public trust, key figures with overlapping power, and a system where money, influence, and silence appear deeply intertwined. The turning point did not come quietly. It arrived the moment private concerns became public conversation. According to multiple accounts, the catalyst was a series of statements and disclosures made by Candace Owens that directly challenged TPUSA's internal financial transparency. What made this moment different from past? Criticism was not just who was speaking, but what was being questioned. This was no longer about ideology or public messaging. It was about money. Specifically, where it was going, how it was being tracked, and why certain financial records appeared unusually difficult to access. Reports suggest that once these concerns were raised publicly, internal dynamics shifted almost immediately. Staff members allegedly described a noticeable change in tone behind closed doors. Meetings became tighter. Communication narrowed. And questions that had once been brushed aside were suddenly treated as liabilities. This was the moment scrutiny escalated from speculation to examination. Viewers, donors, and independent analysts began looking into publicly available filings. Financial forms that had once gone unnoticed were suddenly being dissected line by line, and what they found raised more questions than answers. Allegedly, discrepancies began surfacing missing filings, delayed reports, and unexplained transfers between related entities. None of this, on its own, proved wrongdoing. But taken together, it created a pattern that demanded explanation. And the louder those demands grew, the more noticeable the silence became. This was not just reputational damage. For any large nonprofit, questions about finances trigger a chain reaction audits, oversight, and potential regulatory attention. And according to insiders, that reality caused panic at the highest levels of the organization. Once attention turned to the numbers, several red flags began to surface. According to public filings and independent analysis, money appeared to move between closely linked entities in ways that were difficult for outsiders to follow. Transfers between affiliated organizations, delayed or missing reports, and sudden changes in payroll and headcount raised questions about transparency, not necessarily legality, but clarity. Experts note that nonprofits often use multiple entities for operational reasons. However, problems arise when those structures make it harder for donors to see where funds actually end up. In this case, critics allege that certain transactions obscured real expenses, including executive compensation and operational costs. Again, none of this proves wrongdoing on its own. But patterns matter. And when financial complexity increases at the same moment, scrutiny intensifies. Investigators tend to ask why. With financial questions mounting, attention turned to oversight specifically. Audits and internal reviews that are meant to clarify exactly how money is handled. Audits, when done properly, are designed to do one thing: bring clarity. They track funds, verify filings, and identify inconsistencies before they become serious problems. In theory, this should have been the moment everything settled down. According to critics and insiders, that's not what happened. Instead of transparency, reports describe delays. Instead of clear answers, there was silence. Certain filings were allegedly late or missing, and explanations shifted depending on who was asked. What should have been routine oversight began to feel unusually complicated. The involvement of individuals tied to internal review processes only intensified scrutiny. Questions arose about how independent the audit truly was, what it was authorized to examine, and why its findings, if they existed, were never clearly presented to the public. Again, this does not automatically imply wrongdoing. But in high-stakes organizations, perception matters. And when an audit meant to restore trust ends up creating more uncertainty, investigators and observers take notice. To fully understand the gravity of the situation, it's necessary to examine the sequence of events. The timeline that exposes not just actions, but the inconsistencies and unanswered questions that have fueled ongoing scrutiny. According to multiple sources, the sequence begins well before the public revelations. Internally, discussions about finances and oversight were reportedly ongoing for months. Yet, public-facing narratives painted a picture of routine operations. Documents suggest certain audits were initiated but delayed, and requests for clarification were repeatedly redirected or postponed. These internal delays created gaps in the official record, gaps that became increasingly difficult to reconcile once the spotlight shifted. When Candace Owens publicly raised concerns, the timeline accelerated dramatically. Public attention forced internal communication to tighten. Emails and memos, now examined in retrospect, show a flurry of activity aimed more at controlling the narrative than clarifying the facts. Meetings were convened, decisions made. Yet the outcomes were rarely documented transparently. Snotchy. That some responses were reactive rather than proactive, indicative of an organization trying to manage perception under pressure rather than resolving underlying questions. Simultaneously, financial transactions continued along the same patterns that had originally raised concern. Transfers between affiliated entities, revisions to previously filed documents, and late disclosures compounded the perception of irregularity. Even small discrepancies, when mapped against the accelerated scrutiny, create a narrative where nothing aligns perfectly, timelines that overlap, records that contradict, and explanations that shift with the audience. It is these inconsistencies that analysts focus on. While no single event confirms misconduct, the pressure points created by the timing of audits, public statements, and internal actions reveal a pattern that cannot be ignored. Each unanswered question, each delayed filing, each reaction that seems out of step adds weight to concerns that something deeper may be unfolding behind the scenes. And when behavioral patterns are examined alongside these timelines, an even clearer picture begins to emerge. How individuals respond publicly and privately often speaks louder than documents. Alone a layer of insight that is both subtle and critical to understanding the full scope of this unfolding story, as the financial and timeline discrepancies drew attention. Public behavior from key figures became increasingly scrutinized. Observers and insiders alike note a contrast between expected responses and what was actually seen. In a typical situation, heightened scrutiny prompts a measured, transparent, and immediate response, clear statements, timely disclosures, and visible efforts to clarify concerns. In this case, public appearances and communications were often carefully scripted, with answers that avoided directly addressing the deeper questions. Silence, delays, and occasionally defensive statements became the norm. Erika Kirk, in particular, faced the brunt of public attention. Where one might have expected reassurance or explanation, insiders describe a shift in tone behind closed doors, growing tension, and meticulous control over messaging. The effect was clear, outward composure combined with internal stress. These behavioral patterns, while not proof of wrongdoing, create an impression of urgency and caution, suggesting that individuals were navigating a complex and high-stakes situation. Meanwhile, media coverage amplified every small movement. Public scrutiny, intensified by social media, turned routine statements into headlines and interpretative narratives. Every word, every action nor lack thereof was analyzed, dissected, and debated. In such an environment, even minor inconsistencies or delayed responses can appear more consequential than they might otherwise. Behavior, in this context, becomes a lens through which investigators and viewers alike attempt to read intent and priority. While it cannot serve as hard evidence, it complements financial and procedural anomalies, painting a fuller picture of an organization under pressure. And it sets the stage for the next element, insider accounts that provide a rare, albekosyu gliniano workings behind closed doors, perhaps the most sensitive and revealing aspect of this unfolding story. Commies from insiders willing to speak out. These accounts, often anonymous for safety and professional reasons, provide a glimpse into decisions and actions that are not visible in public filings or statements. According to multiple sources, employees and associates observed patterns of internal communication that raised concern, requests for clarification on financial flows were reportedly met with delays or deflections. Certain audits were described as limited in scope or curated to protect the narrative, leaving critical questions unanswered. These insider observations, while difficult to independently verify, align with anomalies identified in public records, forming a pattern that demands attention. Whistleblowers also described a culture of tight messaging. Information was closely controlled, and staff members were warned against discussing internal matters with external parties. The effect, insiders say, was twofold. It limited transparency and increased internal stress. Those who pushed for clarity reportedly faced pushback, which intensified the pressure on leadership and decision-making layers. It's important to emphasize that while these accounts suggest irregularities, they do not constitute legal proof of wrongdoing. They do, however, add weight to the narrative of tension, mismanagement, and complexity that defines this case. Patterns of control, secrecy, and delayed disclosure when paired with financial and timeline inconsistencies illustrate a situation far more complicated than the public narrative suggests. As scrutiny grew, the question shifted from individual behavior to institutional accountability. Public records, statements, and organizational responses have all been examined closely yet. According to observers, many answers remain elusive. Official statements addressed only surface-level concerns, often reiterating commitments to transparency without providing detailed explanations. Audits, where they existed, were reportedly limited in scope or delayed, leaving critical questions unresolved. Requests for clarifications from donors, journalists, and independent analysts frequently went unanswered or were met with vague assurances. Insiders suggest that these gaps in information were not accidental. By controlling which documents were released and timing statements strategically, the organization effectively managed public perception, even as internal tensions rose. This approach, while protective from a PR standpoint, created the impression of opacity and heightened speculation. What is striking is the number of questions left open. Why were some filings late or altered? Which transactions were approved internally, and by whom? What did audits uncover, and why have the results not been fully disclosed? The absence of clear, comprehensive answers only fuels further curiosity. When institutions fail to fully respond, it shifts the focus back onto patterns, timing, and the behavior of key players, elements that continue to generate debate and analysis. Looking beyond individual actions, a wider pattern begins to emerge, one that connects this case to broader issues in nonprofit oversight, donor influence, and organizational control. Experts and observers note that when large organizations manage significant sums of money, structural opacity can become systemic. Transfers between affiliated entities, selective audits, and tightly controlled messaging are not always illegal, but they can create environments where accountability is difficult to enforce. In this case, the combination of delayed filings, internal secrecy, and public scrutiny suggests that TPUSA's challenges are part of a larger organizational pattern rather than isolated missteps. Furthermore, the timing of public revelations aligned with intense media attention highlights how external pressures interact with internal structures. When scrutiny arrives, systems that rely on centralized control or limited transparency are exposed quickly. Every delayed document, every unclear financial entry, and every cautious public statement feeds a narrative of complexity, if not impropriety. The pattern also extends to the interplay between public figures and organizational operations. Candace Owens' statements, for example, forced previously internal matters into the public eye, exposing gaps in oversight and coordination. This illustrates how power, reputation, and financial management intersect, creating consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate individuals involved. In essence, what began as a focus on specific transactions and internal decisions now reveals a systemic story, one that resonates with concerns about transparency, accountability, and the influence of internal networks in shaping both perception and action. And as with any systemic pattern, the story is far from over. Unreleased documents, ongoing investigations, and continued public attention ensure that new developments could emerge. At any moment, as the layers of this story unfold, one thing becomes clear: much remains hidden. Audits that were meant to provide clarity remain partially incomplete. Internal communications hint at decisions and actions that the public has yet to see. And while some patterns are observable, the full picture is still obscured. Questions linger. What do the unreleased documents reveal? How deep does the financial complexity go? Were there deliberate efforts to control the narrative? And if so, who orchestrated them? Every answer uncovered seems to lead to another question, each more troubling than the last. For viewers following this story, the intrigue is far from resolved. New information could surface at any moment, altering interpretations, confirming suspicions, or raising entirely new concerns. The story of Erika Kirk, TPUSA, and the financial scrutiny tied to Candace Owens. Exposure is evolving and the final chapter has yet to be written. So, we leave you with this question: what is the full truth behind the documents? the audits, and the internal whisperzand who will finally hold the answers accountable. I'm Detective B. If you're fascinated by real life, mysteries, and criminal investigations, tap like, subscribe, and share your opinion in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about today's case. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant. And remember, in true crime, the line between fact and perception is often thinner than we realize.